NatRefs Show, a weekly global podcast on sustainable cooling and heating technologies, brought to you by Sheco and supported by Teco. My name is Andrew Williams, and I'll be hosting today's show from Brussels, Belgium. I'm the European editor of Sheco's industry-leading websites R744.com, Hydrocarbons21.com, and Ammonia21.com. I'm also the editor of Accelerate Europe and Accelerate Australia and New Zealand magazines. I'm joined today by my colleague in the US,
Michael Gary, editor of Accelerate America.
My colleague in Europe,
Charlotte McLaughlin, reporter in Europe.
And my colleague in Asia,
Devin Yoshimoto, reporter for Asia Pacific.
This week we'll discuss AHR Expo, one of the world's biggest HVAC&R trade shows, which took place from 22nd to 24th of January in Chicago. We'll also discuss Europe's first ever supermarket with a rooftop greenhouse. The Deleuze store in Brussels, Belgium uses heat reclaimed from the CO2 transcritical system to heat the greenhouse. And we'll hear from Pilar Aleu from the Brussels team about how a CO2 transcritical system is providing heating and cooling for the Wanda Metropolitano Stadium in Madrid, the new home of Atletico Madrid Football Club. Now over to Michael, who'll kick off our discussion of the AHR Expo.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, last week was a very busy one for myself, my colleague Charlotte McLaughlin, and Mark Shashero of Sheco. We were all attending the AHR Expo, as Andrew said, one of the biggest events of this type in the world. Thousands of exhibitors, tens of thousands of attendees, hundreds of workshops and sessions. It was really an extraordinary event at the McCormick Center in Chicago. And among all of those exhibitors and activity, we did see quite a bit of natural refrigerant technology being promoted and showcased across the different natural refrigerants, hydrocarbons, and CO2 in particular, a little bit on ammonia. On the hydrocarbons front, I attended a morning session with Art Miller of RCS, who emphasized the importance of safety procedures in dealing with these hydrocarbon pieces of equipment, particularly making sure that the equipment itself, as well as the maintenance activity, is spark-free, is to not ignite any leaks. So that's something that is going to be very important going forward, maintaining the safety of these technologies. Several of the big hydrocarbon compressor manufacturers were there, such as Embraco and Tecumseh, both of which featured compressors that are easily plugged in anywhere in the world. So you don't have to. You can make. They could. Companies can make one piece of equipment for hydrocarbons and not have to worry about where it's used, because it's easily. It's a plug and play anywhere in the world. And Emerson got his. Very big on the CO2 side. They exhibited their first hydrocarbon condensing unit for the food service business. So we saw quite a bit of this activity. Isn't that right, Charlotte? You saw some things as well.
Yeah, so similarly, Coulthorne also had a hydrocarbon condensing unit as well that was displayed during the show. And they had a full range of hydrocarbon compressors for domestic and light commercial applications as well. QIE Compressor Barcelona, who's a Chinese-Spanish company, also displayed a full range of hydrocarbon compressors at the show, and they said that they had a lot of interest from the US market, specifically because of, and I think you've talked about this numerous times, Michael, because of the DOE energy efficiency regulations that are sort of driving the market in the light commercial segment towards hydrocarbons.
That's right. The last year, the DOE instituted its much more strict energy requirements for appliances, and that's led to a real surge of hydrocarbon equipment, which is shown to be much more energy efficient.
And just to add on to that real quick, this is one of the key things that's driving manufacturing for hydrocarbon compressors in China. Huayi manufactures hydrocarbon compressors in China, and recently they've told us when we've spoken to them that the demand for their compressors is coming from overseas mostly right now. So places like the United States and Europe, where they have aggressive policies for hydrocarbons.
I think this possibly goes back to a trend which first emerged at the last chill venter in 2016, where we saw, especially in the commercial retail sector, we're seeing hydrocarbons becoming much more competitive with CO2 in the kind of commercial sphere. It's a trend that continued into Euroshop for food retail, and it's interesting to see that it's now coming to the US and China.
Another big theme throughout the AHR Expo, both in the natural refrigerant sphere and really across all spheres, is just the importance of intelligent equipment that brings in data that can better to help end users better deal with efficiency and performance. Tecumseh, for example, introduced this, what they call IntelliCool, which offers onboard diagnostics, remote communications with technicians. That is something that I heard a lot about. For example, it can detect high current and low voltage very fast, so you don't expose your motors and compressors to these conditions and allow them to have a longer life. So that kind of, what we call the IoT, the Internet of Things, which is really about collecting data diagnostically and being able to better manage and control these technologies. It's a big trend that we saw across the show.
Yeah, that's true, Michael. Also, Parker was showing off their IoT software that's designed to work with CO2 transcritical systems, so you can monitor them remotely. And it really helps because you can see, like, the guy took off his phone and just showed me a store. Everything was working perfectly. You can see by the colors that the whole system is running, that the fans are working, that the CO2 transcritical system is working, that the controls are working, that it's hooked up properly to the display cases, and that's all from just looking at your phone remotely. So contractors and technicians can just see from afar if there's any sort of problem. And also they can see where the problem is in the system.
Right. That's going to really drive greater efficiencies, which, of course, is not only cut costs, but also helps the environment. So it's an environmental play as well as, just a better way of doing business. And it ties directly into what we talk about in terms of natural refrigerants helping the environment. CO2 was also heavily showcased at the show. We saw Doran coming out with its first industrial CO2 compressor. Emerson also showcased some of its Copeland compressors that are higher capacity and are able to be used for larger commercial and even small industrial applications. So again, the entry of CO2 to a greater degree into the industrial arena is taking place in America. I think that's an important trend.
Yeah, and I would add that it's not just compressor manufacturers, but also other OEMs like Günther, for instance, who is advocating for their heat exchangers to also be used in CO2 large transcritical systems, and they see this as kind of the next big trend in North America.
Right, absolutely.
And we have to mention that Günther is betting on that in Japan as well. We just had an article that we put out on our websites about Günther really expecting CO2 transcritical to play a big role in the Japanese market this year.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We're seeing CO2 transcritical now then across the world become more competitive with ammonia at this industrial scale of application, whether that's for kind of cold stores, distribution centres, etc. There's a number of companies keen to push the benefits of CO2 technology for these applications as well.
And I think, Michael, as well, like previously in the last Accelerate America, you talked about this this trend that those who are working with industrial systems have more money to work with as well, because they're not as driven by cost as supermarkets in the US.
Yeah, we saw last year the industrial side making bigger investments in new technology than the commercial supermarket side for a variety of reasons. But yeah, that's something definitely to make note of in terms of introducing new systems like CO2.
Michael, what about taking a step back? I mean, obviously you've been to a few AHR Expos over the years. In terms of the prominence of natural refrigerant solutions on display at the show, how would this year's show compare to previous editions, in your opinion?
I think that we continue to see progress. We continue to see technology advancements on display at AHR Expo. Maybe not in terms of the sheer number of companies, because the North American market is still has a ways to go, catch up to other parts of the world in terms of naturals. But we certainly the companies that do address the naturals continue to enhance their technology, continue to expand it and add energy savings, efficiencies, kinds of components to it. So I think we see progress, no question. I mean, on the CO2 side, Carell talked about its HECU controller for CO2 condensing units, and also launched their modulating ejectors in the U.S., which of course will help to improve the efficiency of transcritical in warmer climates. That's a trend that the ejector trend is just beginning to take root in the U.S. And so Carell's trying to capitalize on that with this modulating ejector, and Emerson is bringing its. It has a what they call iPro rack controller for CO2. It's prevalent in Europe. Bringing it to the U.S. It's also one of these intelligent devices that integrates things like the high pressure valves and bypass valves that were previously had their own separate controls. So that we're seeing really, the European technology continuing to be brought to the U.S. by companies like Carell and Emerson.
Yeah, I think certainly the connectivity and the Internet of Things aspect is an area in which we're going to see the HVAC&R sector innovate even more. Devin will be able to tell us about that in a few weeks' time from the supermarket trade show in Tokyo, right? Where I think we can expect a continuation of some of the trends that we've been talking about today.
Yes, definitely. Supermarket trade show is coming up very soon. And of course, Atmosphere Japan is coming up very soon also. And those two events are very close together. So a lot to report from that time.
One last thing to say about AHR is Maekawa introduced another ammonia CO2 chiller at AHR. It introduced a couple of these chillers last year and continued again this year with what they call the Sierra A model, which is a smaller capacity chiller that is air-cooled and is suited for smaller jobs, including dock cooling and industrial plants. So that was another. We're seeing these packaged, ammonia CO2 units or low-charge ammonia units increasingly coming out in the U.S. market. So this is another example of that.
And some competition there also then for the homegrown American companies like HVAC&R in this area.
That's true.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for that report. Recently we travelled to a Delhaize supermarket in Brussels, Belgium. This is Europe's first supermarket to have greenhouses on the roof. Now, what's special about this for us is that the heat reclaimed from the supermarket's transcritical CO2 refrigeration system is reclaimed to heat the greenhouses. It's a remodeled supermarket in the suburb of Ixelles in the Belgian capital. The store is called Delhaize Boondale Store.
Can you tell me more about how the CO2 transcritical system utilizes the heat reclaim?
Yes, so unique. This store is from an architectural point of view, is unique in that the ground floor is the supermarket. Above the supermarket, you have the car park, and above the car park, you have the roof on which there's a large greenhouse for growing fruit and vegetables that are sold in the store down below. By putting the car park on the roof, you have the transcritical refrigeration rack also on the same floor as the car park. The rack is used to cool and heat the supermarket itself, and the excess heat from that Advancor CO2 transcritical rack is reclaimed, sent upstairs onto the roof into the greenhouses, and heats the greenhouses for growing the produce. And the produce is then sold down below in the supermarket.
And when did the store open?
On the 18th of October 2017. Since then they've been fine-tuning the system and now ready to communicate about it in a big way. So I look forward to coverage of this in the upcoming edition of Accelerate Europe. One of the things that Delays is keen to do with this store, it's about being at the heart of the community. So they see it as a community project. They have a educational area also on the roof where local schools are invited. They're doing tours of the greenhouse, and it's overlooked by several apartment buildings in the area. So it's very much also about putting this sustainable community greenhouse project at the heart of the community.
And do they explain to the kids who visit about the CO2 refrigeration system? And
Yes. So of course it's because the CO2 transcritical is at the heart of the project. It's providing the heat for the greenhouses. This is also an opportunity, of course, for them to communicate about natural refrigerants in this specific store, but also more generally about their policy of using CO2 in supermarkets.
Okay, Andrew, and I think Pilar as well, you have a really interesting story about how CO2 transcritical is being used in a stadium in Madrid.
Thanks, Charlotte. Yes, indeed, natural refrigerants are also at the heart of Atletico Madrid new football stadium, the Wanda Metropolitano in Spain, that opened the doors in September last year. And this facility has a capacity for 68,000 people and is using CO2 transcritical system together with parallel compressors and multi-ejectors. Pecomar is a Spanish company, provided a system and is working in partnership with Fagos, Danfoss, Bitzer, Eco, Dinafri and Automatiza, also a national company. And this system provides cooling for a large kitchen that is serving different restaurants and VIP lounges. And it's very cool because the CO2 system is also delivering water at very high temperatures and is functioning effectively even when... Oh shit, no, I'm not gonna say this, sorry. Okay, perfect. And it's a very cool project because the heat recovery from the CO2 system is used for making hot water and also heating the soccer pitch.
So it's similar to the Delay store, heat recovery again is being used.
Yes, I think what we're seeing here, it's interesting and it's a sign of perhaps a trend that we might see more of in the future. So it's about integrating the refrigeration system into the wider heating and cooling needs of the location. So an important point about the Delays one is that this is obviously the first time they've ever done this, and they may continue to do this in other stores. Whether it can be done depends on the location and the structure, because you need to have a roof that can support the weight of the greenhouses, etc. But from the point of view of what's happening with the transcritical rack, from a sustainability point of view, this is a great idea because you are not wasting any of the waste heat. There's more than enough heat being produced and reclaimed from the refrigeration system to provide the hot water needs of the store, to heat the store most of the year except for on the coldest winter days where they do need some extra. Similar in Madrid, we're seeing the CO2 transcritical system provide the heating needs as well and the hot water needs for a football stadium. So I think in terms of a business model for natural refrigerants, this is extremely interesting. Perhaps we might be seeing the beginning of the end of having a cooling system and a heating system and having to buy both separately. It's about integrated systems. That brings this week's podcast to a close. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to tune in next week for another great NatRefs show.